In August 1945, two flashes of light turned cities into shadows. In mere seconds, 200,000 lives vanished, and yet that wasn't the most shocking part of Japan's surrender. The year was 1945. The world had already been burning for 6 long years. Cities across Europe lay in ruins, the swastika had fallen, and Hitler was dead. But across the vast blue waters of the Pacific, another inferno raged on. While Europe began to rebuild, the Pacific was entering its most violent, desperate, and catastrophic stage. Japan, once an island empire of ambition and discipline, now stood cornered. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor to the jungles of Burma, their soldiers had fought with unbreakable will. But now their empire was collapsing. The Allies were closing in from every direction. The Americans from the east, the British from the south, the Soviets preparing from the north. The circle was tightening, and Japan knew the end was near. Yet surrender was unthinkable. The Pacific Ocean had become a graveyard. From Iwo Jima to Okinawa, each battle was more brutal than the last. Every island was a fortress, every hill a tomb. The Japanese soldiers fought not to win, but to die with honor. They were told that surrender was shame, that death was glory. So when the Americans landed, they faced not an army retreating, but a nation prepared for extinction. The Allied forces had learned that every step closer to Japan would cost thousands of lives. The Battle of Iwo Jima alone turned volcanic rock into a nightmare. 20,000 Japanese dead, 7,000 Americans gone. On Okinawa it was worse. Civilians, women, children, the elderly, jumped from cliffs rather than surrender. The sea turned red. The skies rained steel. Humanity had reached the edge of sanity, and yet Tokyo refused to yield. Inside the war rooms, Japan's leaders clung to an illusion that somehow a decisive victory could force the Allies to negotiate peace. They believed in a miracle that would never come. Meanwhile, American bombers filled the skies, turning night into fire. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, entire cities burned to the ground. The B-29 raids weren't just attacks. They were apocalyptic storms. Wooden homes vanished in flames, leaving only shadows on the pavement. By the summer of 1945, Japan's empire had shrunk to its home islands. The navy was gone, the air force crippled, the people starving. Yet still, the government refused surrender. Emperor Hirohito remained silent, trapped between his pride and his people's suffering. Millions of civilians dug tunnels, sharpened bamboo spears, and prepared to die defending their emperor. Japan had become a nation ready for collective suicide. In Washington, a new weapon was waiting, a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Manhattan Project had birthed the atomic bomb, a machine of light and death capable of ending the war in one stroke. Or beginning something far darker. President Truman faced an impossible choice: invade Japan at the cost of 1 million lives, or unleash the power of the atom. As the decision neared, the Allies issued an ultimatum, the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. But Tokyo rejected it. Pride, fear, and delusion kept them from accepting reality. They still believed they could negotiate better terms. They still believed that dying for the emperor was sacred. Then came August 6, 1945. A single bomber, the Enola Gay, crossed the morning sky over Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the world changed forever. A blinding flash lit the horizon, followed by a roar that silenced everything. In seconds, a city of 300,000 ceased to exist. Tens of thousands were vaporized. The survivors wandered in silence, their skin burned, their shadows etched into the ground. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed, another city erased. The message was clear: surrender or total annihilation. And yet even then, Japan's military hardliners resisted. Some wanted to fight on, to let the entire nation burn rather than surrender. The cabinet was split, one half praying for peace, the other for destruction. It was the emperor himself who finally broke the silence. In a rare and trembling voice, he ordered surrender, not for victory, but to save what remained of Japan. On August 15, 1945, the Emperor's voice echoed across the radio waves for the first time in history. The people wept. The war was over, but the victory came at an unbearable cost. Millions dead, cities gone, and a world forever changed. The final months of the Pacific War weren't just the end of a conflict. They were the end of an era, a moment when humanity saw the true face of its own destruction. The road to Japan's unconditional surrender was not paved with triumph, but with blood, fire, and the haunting realization that even victory can feel like loss. The Pacific War was not just a conflict between nations. It was a clash between two worlds, two philosophies and two definitions of honor. On one side stood an empire built on discipline, loyalty, and sacrifice. On the other stood a nation driven by freedom, vengeance, and the unrelenting will to end a nightmare that had begun with the attack on Pearl Harbor. After the fall of Germany in May 1945, the eyes of the world turned east. The Pacific was now the center of the storm. Every island, every stretch of ocean was a stepping stone toward the Japanese mainland. But the closer the Allies came, the more brutal the fighting became. The Americans called it island hopping. To the soldiers who lived it, it was a descent into hell. The Japanese turned every patch of land into a fortress. They dug tunnels, built bunkers, and hid deep within the earth. There was no retreat, no surrender, only death. On the black sands of Iwo Jima, 20,000 Japanese soldiers waited underground, silent and unseen. When the Marines landed, the island erupted in fire. What followed was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. The air was thick with smoke, the ground slick with blood. Marines fought inch by inch, yard by yard, for a piece of volcanic rock that seemed to belong to no one. It took 36 days to claim that island. 36 days to raise the American flag atop Mount Suribachi, a symbol of victory carved out of unimaginable loss. Nearly 7,000 Americans were dead. But for Japan, the loss of Iwo Jima meant something far worse. The path to their homeland was open. Then came Okinawa, the largest and deadliest battle of the Pacific. The island was Japan's last defense before the home islands. The fighting lasted 82 days. The Japanese unleashed everything: kamikaze pilots diving into American ships, suicide charges, civilians forced into death by propaganda and fear. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and nearly as many civilians perished. Whole families leapt from cliffs into the sea rather than surrender. For the Americans, Okinawa was a warning, an omen of what awaited them if they invaded Japan itself. If one small island cost so much blood, what would happen when they reached Tokyo? Military planners estimated an invasion could cost up to 1 million Allied lives, and even more Japanese. Meanwhile, Japan's cities were already under siege from the skies. American B-29 bombers launched relentless firebombing raids, flattening entire cities. The night of March 9, 1945, saw Tokyo consumed in flames. In just a few hours, 100,000 civilians were killed, more than either atomic bomb would claim later. The fires burned so hot they created their own wind, pulling oxygen from the air and suffocating thousands. Still, Japan did not surrender. The government clung to the illusion of negotiation. They hoped to use the Soviet Union as a mediator for peace, not realizing that Stalin had already promised to attack them once Germany was defeated. As summer approached, the war reached its breaking point. American forces were readying for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan. The Japanese military was preparing for a final stand. Children drilled with bamboo spears, women sewed explosive vests, and the emperor's soldiers swore to defend the homeland to their last breath. It would have been the bloodiest battle in human history, but then the world changed forever. In a secret project known as Manhattan, American scientists had harnessed the power of the atom, a weapon so powerful it could erase a city in an instant. When President Truman received news of its success, he faced an impossible decision: unleash this new weapon to end the war. or risk millions of lives in an invasion? On August 6, 1945, that decision was made. A B-29 named Enola Gay flew toward Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., a blinding flash turned the city into a furnace. Within seconds, tens of thousands were gone, vaporized by light hotter than the sun. The city burned for days. Survivors wandered through ruins, their skin hanging in ribbons. The world had entered the atomic age. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The destruction was beyond comprehension. In a matter of days, 2 cities had vanished and more than 200,000 lives were lost. And then another blow came. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan, invading Manchuria with overwhelming force. The Japanese army, already broken and scattered, could not resist. The illusion of survival was shattered. Inside Tokyo's imperial palace, chaos and despair ruled. Some generals demanded one final stand, a national suicide. Others begged for peace. The emperor, silent until then, faced the hardest decision of his life. In the early hours of August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke to his people for the first time. His voice trembled over the radio, speaking of enduring the unendurable. Japan would surrender. When the announcement was made, millions fell to their knees. Soldiers wept. Mothers held their children in silence. For the first time in its history, Japan had been defeated. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the Japanese delegation signed the document of unconditional surrender. General Douglas MacArthur stood tall as history unfolded before him. The Pacific War, one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, was finally over. But peace did not come easily. Japan lay in ruins. More than 3 million of its people were dead. Its cities were ash, its spirit broken. Yet from those ashes, a new nation would rise, one that would rebuild, reinvent, and ultimately redefine itself in the decades to come. The Pacific War was more than a battle between armies. It was a mirror reflecting the extremes of human will, courage and cruelty, honor and horror, destruction and rebirth. It showed the world that war, when pushed to its final limit, destroys not only the enemy, but the soul of humanity itself. The summer of 1945 had arrived, and the Pacific War teetered on the edge of absolute catastrophe. Japan's empire, once sprawling across thousands of miles of ocean, had shrunk to a few home islands. Its military was exhausted. Its cities lay in ruins. Yet its leaders refused to surrender. Pride, honor, and the Bushido Code demanded one final stand, a last, desperate resistance, no matter the cost. Across the ocean, the Allies prepared for the invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall. Military planners predicted a bloodbath, a fight that could claim millions of lives, Allied and Japanese alike. Okinawa had been only a prelude. The Americans knew that landing troops on the Japanese mainland would unleash horrors beyond imagination. And then came the first unimaginable shock, a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Manhattan Project had succeeded. The atomic bomb, a bomb capable of leveling a city in seconds, was ready. Its existence was no longer theoretical. Its destructive power was about to be tested on real human lives. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay crossed the skies above Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., a blinding flash lit the morning sky. In an instant, tens of thousands of people were incinerated. Buildings disintegrated. The city, once bustling with life, became a landscape of shadows, literally etched into the ground as human forms vaporized by unimaginable heat. Survivors wandered like ghosts through the ruins, their screams swallowed by the silence of devastation. Japan's government was stunned, but still indecisive. Many military leaders refused to surrender. They still clung to the hope that negotiations, resistance, or a miracle might save their nation from total annihilation. The emperor remained silent. The people, meanwhile, faced a horrifying reality. The war had entered a new phase, one that could end every life in an instant. 3 days later, the second bomb fell, Nagasaki. August 9th, 1945. The devastation was even more horrific and the psychological impact profound. Japan's leaders could no longer ignore the truth. The war had reached a point where no strategy could prevent total destruction. Cities would be erased, millions of lives lost, unless the unthinkable, surrender, was finally accepted, as if to remove any remaining illusions. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan on the same day, invading Japanese-occupied Manchuria with overwhelming force. The Japanese military, already crippled, was now confronted with the reality of a two-front war. The dream of negotiating favorable peace terms evaporated in the face of this double blow. The nation stood at the precipice of annihilation. Inside the imperial palace, the cabinet was divided. Military leaders demanded continued resistance, hoping for a final showdown. Diplomats and bureaucrats pleaded for surrender, knowing that further delay would mean the death of millions more. In this moment of crisis, all eyes turned to Emperor Hirohito, the symbolic and moral center of Japan. On August 15th, 1945, in a rare and unprecedented broadcast, Hirohito addressed the nation. His voice, soft yet resolute, carried across radios for the first time in history. He spoke of the unendurable suffering of his people and the necessity of surrender. He framed the decision not as defeat, but as a duty to save the surviving population. For the first time, the Japanese people heard their emperor's words, guiding them toward survival rather than martyrdom. This announcement was the turning point, the moment that ended not only the war, but Japan's centuries-old struggle with the concept of unconditional surrender. It was a moral and strategic collapse, forced upon the nation by an unrelenting combination of technological destruction, military impossibility, and political reality. The surrender was formalized on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Japanese officials signed the document of unconditional surrender while General Douglas MacArthur oversaw the proceedings. The war was over. The Pacific, once a theater of unending bloodshed, fell silent. Yet the turning point was more than a military or political moment. It was a human one. Millions of civilians had lived through firebombings, starvation, and the ever-present threat of annihilation. Soldiers had fought to the last breath on volcanic islands, defending a nation they knew might never win. The emperor's decision symbolized not just surrender, but the preservation of what remained of humanity, the fragile lives of civilians, the possibility of rebuilding, the chance to learn from the horrors unleashed. The atomic bombings and Soviet invasion had forced Japan to confront a terrifying reality. Victory was no longer possible, and continued resistance would mean total destruction. In that moment, the scales of history tipped. One man's voice, Emperor Hirohito, guided the nation away from suicide, saving millions of lives, and signaling the end of the deadliest chapter in the Pacific War. The turning point was a collision of technology, strategy, and morality. It marked the moment when war reached the limits of human endurance and forced a nation to redefine its values in the face of total annihilation. It was the moment when fire, blood, and diplomacy combined to compel surrender, and when the world learned the terrifying power of modern warfare. From that point onward, Japan entered a new era, one defined not by conquest, but by survival, reflection, and eventual rebuilding. The Pacific War had ended, but its lessons would echo for generations. The cost of pride, the price of stubbornness, and the devastating consequences of underestimating the unstoppable force of history. The Pacific War was more than a series of battles. It was a testament to human endurance, courage, and, tragically, the cost of stubborn pride. Millions of lives were lost, cities were destroyed, and a nation teetered on the edge of annihilation. But amidst this horror lies a lesson for every generation. The choices we make, as individuals or nations, define the world we leave behind. We have seen what happens when power is wielded without mercy. when pride outweighs reason, and when humanity forgets its moral compass. We have witnessed the unimaginable, cities erased, families lost, and entire nations brought to their knees. Yet we have also seen the other side of humanity, the courage of those who fought to survive, the compassion of those who helped strangers, and the wisdom of leaders who ultimately chose life over destruction. The call to action is simple but profound. Learn from history, act with courage, and choose reason over pride. Let the horrors of Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki remind us that stubbornness can cost lives beyond imagination. Let the words of Emperor Hirohito, spoken with a trembling voice but a resolute heart, remind us that leadership is not about ego, it is about responsibility. Today, the world faces challenges not unlike those of 1945, conflicts, division, and the temptation to let pride dictate action are ever present. We must ask ourselves, will we repeat the mistakes of the past, or will we step forward with courage, wisdom, and compassion? Every decision matters. Every voice matters. Every act of reason or humanity can prevent catastrophe. We owe it to the millions who perished to honor their memory by choosing peace over war, dialogue over violence, and humanity over hubris. The Pacific War ended decades ago, but its lessons are eternal. History has already spoken. Now it is our turn to listen, to act, and to ensure that the bloody road to surrender is never walked again. So look within yourself and within your community. Choose action over inaction. Choose unity over division. And above all, choose a world where the mistakes of the past do not become the tragedies of the future. The road to peace begins with each of us, with the courage to learn, the wisdom to act, and the compassion to save lives before it is too late.